Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about the Solicitors Qualifying Examination, or SQE, as we typically call it, and that's what we'll be referring to it throughout this webinar today. And in particular, we're going to be talking today about the SQE and what it means for qualified lawyers. I'm Maxine Waugh, and I'm Head of Education and Training at the SRA, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Carol Cook and Natalie Croton, who are both responsible for dealing with applications and queries from qualified lawyers. So I'll be chairing the webinar, and Carol and Natalie will be giving you information and top tips on what the SQE means for qualified lawyers. Now, most of you will know that the SQE came into force in September last year, so in September 2021, and we ran the first assessments very successfully in November 2021. And since we launched the SQE and we ran the first assessments, we've had lots and lots of inquiries and queries from qualified lawyers who are interested in qualifying as a solicitor in England and Wales. And in particular, we get lots of queries about how qualified lawyers can apply for exemptions from the SQE. And we also get lots of queries from qualified lawyers about the transitional arrangements, which are the arrangements for anybody who previously started to qualify as a solicitor in England and Wales under the Qualified Lawyers Transfer Scheme. So we're going to deal with those two areas in particular on the webinar today, exemptions and transitional arrangements. But we will also be talking generally about the SQE and how you qualify as a solicitor. Before we start, if anyone does have any questions for us, we are able to take some questions live on this webinar today. And if you do have any, please post them into the link below the webinar. You will also find a link to an evaluation form under the webinar as well, and I'll remind you about that again at the end of the webinar. We would be really grateful if you would complete that. We've also had some questions in advance of the webinar, and we'll go through a couple of those throughout the webinar and at the end of the webinar as well. The one thing that I will just say before we kick off is that we're not able to answer individual queries from people about their particular circumstances on this webinar. We have had a few people who have asked us questions about how their personal qualifications and experience might count towards an exemption. And we can't answer those types of queries on individual circumstances. We can really only make a judgment about individual circumstances once we receive in a full application. So we won't be answering those types of queries, but please do post any other types of queries into the link, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And then just before we kick off, the final thing I would say is I do live with a rather terrifying cat, and the cat likes to come and join me sometimes when I'm working. But the other thing that my cat likes to do is if I ignore it, as I clearly will do when I'm delivering this webinar, it does like to sometimes bite my ankles. So it's just a warning that if you do see me behaving rather strangely, it could be because my cat is biting my ankles. But I do hope that that doesn't happen today. So let's kick off then. Carol, let's start at the beginning with the basics. Can you tell us what the requirements are for qualifying as a solicitor in England and Wales if you're a qualified lawyer?
Yes, thanks, Maxine. We've put them out on this slide here. So the candidate or the applicant has got to hold a legal qualification. Oh, right, yeah. So hold a legal qualification which allows you to practice in the UK or in an international jurisdiction. Have a degree or other level 6 qualification. That would be something equivalent to a bachelor's degree from a UK university, for example. Pass SQE1 and SQE2 assessments and meet our character and suitability requirements. And note on this, there is no requirement for a qualified lawyer to have qualifying work experience.
So that's a really important point, isn't it, Carol? We get quite a lot of questions about that, don't we? And there has been quite a lot of confusion about it. So just to be very, very clear, if you're a qualified lawyer and you want to qualify as a solicitor in England and Wales, You do not have to do qualifying work experience, which is a requirement for people who are not qualified lawyers.
That's right, Maxine. But of course, an applicant's work experience could become very relevant to their application, and we'll look at that a bit later on. But it's not the same requirement for qualifying work experience, which is a requirement for non-qualified lawyers.
Thanks, Carol. That's a really helpful clarification. I think people would probably find it quite helpful to have an overview of the SQE assessments, Carol. You've mentioned that everybody has to take both SQE assessments. So can you give us a little bit more information about what those assessments entail?
Sure, yes. So again, set out very briefly on the slide here. But what I would say is there's a lot of information about all of this on the SQE website, and particularly the assessment specification. It's a really important document. But at the sort of, the key points are SQE1 has two parts to it. We call it functioning legal knowledge 1. We use FLK1 for shorthand. Functioning legal knowledge 2. And the rationale here is this is an assessment where candidates are required to identify core legal principles and apply them to client problems and transactions. They're taken over 2 full days, and they can be done in centres in the UK, or they can be done in certain international centres. And the cost of SQE1 is £1,558. They're VAT exempt, so there is no VAT on that. SQE2 is now the focus of SQE2 is on the application of that law through the demonstration of competence in these legal skills. So they test legal skills and functioning legal knowledge equally. They're simulated tasks, which would be very realistically those carried out by a solicitor in practice, and they're both written tests and oral tests. The written tests, they can be done in the same way as the SQE1 test. They can be done in UK and international centres. But because of the very particular nature of the assessments, the oral assessments are currently done they're offered in UK centres in Cardiff, Manchester and London. So an applicant would have to come to the UK to complete SQE2. And the cost for SQE2 is £2,422. And again, that's VAT exempt.
So you mentioned the cost there, Carol, and we've had quite a few queries about costs. People are interested in how much it will cost them to qualify as a solicitor in England and Wales. So the cost of the assessment's not the only cost, is it? Can you explain how that works for us?
Yeah, sure. So the cost that I've just quoted on the slide there is the assessment fee. It goes to the fee. But if an applicant wants to do some training or a course in preparation for the assessment, then they would need to factor that in. For SQE2 oral, for example, there would be the cost of coming to the UK, possibly accommodation as well during the run of the assessment. So these are all things that need to be taken into account in working out exactly what the cost is to an individual of sitting the SQE.
And the purpose of this webinar is for understanding how qualified lawyers qualify as a solicitor in England and Wales. And we've talked about qualified lawyers already quite a lot. Now, we have a specific definition of qualified lawyer, don't we? Can you explain what we mean by a qualified lawyer in this context?
Yeah, sure. So a qualified lawyer is someone who holds a professional legal qualification that we recognise and which confers the rights to practice either in England and Wales or outside of England and Wales. So that includes overseas jurisdictions. So, for example, you know, we've recognised the qualification of Italian avocatos, Danish advocates, but also it would include barristers, it will include Scottish solicitors, and it will include solicitors who have qualified in Ireland.
Okay, well, that's interesting, Carol. So just to be clear, a qualified lawyer isn't just a lawyer from outside of England and Wales. It does also include qualified lawyers within England and Wales as well.
Yeah, Silex, for example, a chartered legal executive would be included in that. That's right, Maxine.
Thanks, Carol. So we've talked about exemptions very broadly. Can you explain, Carol, what exemptions are available for qualified lawyers if they want to apply for them?
Okay, yeah. So an exemption is available for either part or both parts of SQE1. So that would be FLK1 and or FLK2. But SQE2 is not an assessment which is divisible in parts, so we could only grant an exemption for all of SQE2 or not at all.
Okay, thank you. And we get quite a lot of queries, don't we, from qualified lawyers who want to understand what it is that we look at when we're deciding whether someone can have an exemption or not. Do we look at the same things when we're looking at our applications for SQE1 and SQE2, or are we looking at different things?
No, we look at different things, and actually, if we start with SQE2 first, Maxine, because that tends to be more straightforward. So the first thing we would do when we receive an application for exemption from SQE2 is look at the practice rights that have been granted to that individual by virtue of holding that qualification. Now, by looking at the practice rights, that really helps us. It gives us some insight into what particular competencies and skills that individual may have been required to demonstrate and apply in the acquisition of that qualification. So the practice rights that we are interested in are the conduct of criminal litigation, and that would include advising clients at the police station. The conduct of civil litigation, dispute resolution, you can see I've put them on the slide there, property practice, wills, intestacy, probate, administration of estates and practice, and business organisation rules and procedures. So if anyone on the webinar has looked at our application form, you'll see that that's pretty much the very first question we ask about the qualification that they hold.
So I'm sure there's people listening, Carol, who are thinking, well, I don't have all of those practice rights. What does that mean? Does that mean I can't apply for an exemption at all?
No, it doesn't mean that at all. If you don't have all the practice rights, then what we do ask you to do is move a little bit further on in the application process and explain to us how you have developed and demonstrated a range of competencies that we would, if you like, associate with those practice rights. And there's a table in the form which will around advocacy skills, drafting skills, interviewing skills, practice in advising candidates, advising clients, not candidates. And we would just ask you to complete the table. So you might only have one, that your qualification might have only one practice right, or what we see more commonly is all practice rights with the exception of the right to conduct litigation, for example. So what we would need therefore is evidence of advocacy skills.
So I think what we're saying, Carol, is that if you do have all of those practice rights, it's likely to be a more straightforward application for exemption from SQE2. But if you don't have all that practice rights, you can still apply, but we will require more information from you.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Thank you. Let's turn now to you, Natalie. We do have some agreed exemptions, exemptions that we've already looked at and agreed. Can you tell us, Natalie, your team's responsible for dealing with these applications for agreed exemptions. Have we already granted any agreed exemptions?
Yep, so we have already granted some agreed exemptions, and these are for the SQE2 assessment only. So we don't actually have any agreed exemptions for the SQE1 assessments. So just to confirm, those agreed exemptions that we have granted for the SQE2 assessment include an advogado in Brazil, an advocate in Denmark, Faroe Islands, and Greenland, a solicitor in Hong Kong, an advocate in Romania, and a solicitor in Scotland.
Thanks, Natalie. So as you say, we don't at the moment have any agreed exemptions for SQE1. We do have some applications in the pipeline, and if at some future point we do agree any exemptions for SQE1, then we will of course make that information available on our website. And Natalie, what about lawyers who qualified in the UK, for example, solicitors qualified in Northern Ireland, or Silex lawyers who we previously mentioned?
Yeah, so we have reviewed some of those qualifications, and I think the best advice would probably be to take a look on our website, as we do have lots of information on there and guidance on there for people who do hold those qualifications.
Thanks, Natalie. So let's go back to you, Carol. We've talked about exemptions from SQE2, which I think typically, if we're honest, tend to be the more straightforward applications. Can you talk us through exemptions from SQE1, and what do people need to know about exemptions from SQE1 assessments?
Yeah, sure. So first thing is that we are looking for equivalence in content and standard. So you'll see on this slide here, so we're looking at evidence of equivalence in the content of our FLK statements. So the applicant has got to show that they have experience of the law of England and Wales, or they have experience of the law which is not substantially different to the law of England and Wales. So what does that mean? Well, it's got to be sufficient to enable an individual to identify the principles of English and Welsh law that are relevant to a particular matter or a transaction, and apply those principles accurately, appropriately, and effectively to that matter in relation to all subjects assessed by SQE1. So everything in FLK1 if you're applying for FLK exemption, everything in FLK2 if you're applying for FLK2 exemption, and everything in both if you're applying for exemption from both. It might be helpful to know in terms of how we've approached this, that we did review the qualification completed by solicitors who qualify in Scotland, and we decided that, you know, in terms of standard, there was a high correlation in standard. Clearly there would be, but actually in content there wasn't a high correlation, and there were a number of areas of law and practice, property practice, conveyancing, criminal litigation, or criminal practice and litigation, for example, where there wasn't sufficient equivalence at all. And so there are no exemptions from SQE1 for Scottish solicitors. Now, that doesn't mean that a Scottish qualified solicitor can't apply for SQE1, but they would need to show more. There's something more that we would need in addition to having that qualification. Also, we do have queries from candidates who are partway through the QLTS qualification route, and they hold the MCT. And the MCT does not map comprehensively in content to either FLK1 or FLK2. So that's the first stage of the test. The second part of the test is that it's got to be equivalent in standard. So again, you'll see on the slide there, it's got to align to level 3 of our threshold standard, again, which is on our website. And I can't stress enough how important it is to go and look at the assessment specification and the threshold standard, because that is the clearest guidance you will get as to what it is we need to be satisfied of. So again, being able to identify legal principles relevant to the matter and progress them accurately and efficiently using own judgment. So you will see there in the bullet points there, those are the key characteristics that must be met for our threshold standard. And by way of example, again, we do get quite a lot of inquiries from applicants who hold the legal practice course qualification, and they also maybe hold the QLD, they've also got a qualifying law degree or the common professional exam. Whilst they may map quite nicely actually in content, what they don't do is map to standard, because neither of those are a point of qualification assessment. The standard for passing the LPC and the QLD is not at the standard of a newly qualified solicitor. They are part of a qualification framework that was progressive in nature and were always going to usually occur before a 2-year period of training.
So I think, Carol, the main message there for people listening today is that actually it's a pretty high bar to get an exemption from the SQE1 assessments.
It is. It's a high bar, and it's a rightly high bar, because I think if you look at the assessment specification, you look at the threshold standard, you look at how the pass mark is set for SQE1, for example, then I think it shows you what all, it's the bar that all candidates have to meet in order to progress onto SQE2 and then to qualify.
Thank you. Let's move back to you, Natalie. If someone thinks that they meet the requirements that Carol has set out for either SQE1 or SQE2 exemption, your team deals with these applications. Can you tell people what do they need to do if they want to apply for an exemption?
Yeah, so I think more from a process side of things. So just to make sure that you firstly have a My SRA account, as this is where you'll need to submit the application through. So if you don't already have one, you can make one. And you can do this by going onto our website, and there'll be a link at the top with a My SRA button, and it will take you to the login page, and you should be able to click on create an account. You can enter your details and you can verify your account, and then you'll be all set up. Once you've done that and you're set up, you can go and find the application form. So if you click select start new applications, the application form is titled Qualified Lawyers Application for Recognition of Professional Qualifications and or Experience, and you'll be able to download the form and complete it in full, and then you can go on to submit it through the My SRA portal, and the end part will be paying the fee of £265. And just to confirm, as Maxine discussed at the beginning, and we do have a lot of queries about individual circumstances, and I'd say the best thing to do is put your application together if you do want to make an application for exemption from the SQE assessments. Make sure it's as complete as it can be, as we can't tell you whether you're likely to get an exemption until we receive that application and it comes to a caseworker, and we're able to assess it then.
And we've already received quite a high number of applications. You and your team, Natalie, have been incredibly busy looking at these applications, haven't you? So you must, by this point, have some top tips for people in completing these applications. Can you talk us through what would be your top tips to people that are listening today if they want to put in an application for exemption?
Yes, I definitely do have some top tips, so I'll just go through a few of them now. So the first one would be to read our guidance on our website. So we do have a lot of information on there about the exemption application for qualified lawyers. So I think taking some time to read that first is important. As I just discussed, you can download the application form on my SRA, and when you do, I'd probably take some time to read that, as it's quite long, and try and understand what the application is actually looking for, and whether you can meet each of the individual requirements at the correct standard. Also, make sure when you're completing your application form to use specific examples. So it is evidence based. So we need you to try and show us how you meet the criteria instead of just simply stating that you have the experience. It's really good if you can use some specific examples and try to avoid any repetition. We also ask that any work experience that you're putting forward on your application does need to be corroborated. So this is in the form of a detailed reference, ideally from your supervisor, but we do understand that not everybody has a supervisor, so it would be someone that you work alongside that's at your level or above. And yeah, so the references do need to meet certain requirements, and I'd again point you to the website because there is a lot of information on there about what we require to be included in our references. It's also important to note that your referee, if they're not SRA regulated, we will require their certificate of good standing, which does need to be dated within the last 3 months. And just the final point there is making sure that everything you're providing with your application, so any supporting information and evidence, is actually relevant to the application. So references, for example, they do need to be written for the purpose of this application. Any work samples need to be cross-referenced to the examples that you're given in your application form. So just make sure everything you're giving us is there for a reason.
And you mentioned, Natalie, there that the referees need a certificate of good standing, but also all qualified lawyers will need a certificate of good standing when they apply to us to become a solicitor, don't they?
Yeah, that's right, Maxine. So when they get to admission, we'll require their certificate of good standing too. And that's so we understand some qualified lawyers might be qualified in multiple jurisdictions. So we'll need their certificate of good standing for all the jurisdictions where they hold a professional legal qualification and have been admitted.
So I'm sure everyone's found those tips really useful, Natalie, and it's really clear that we do need quite detailed and comprehensive information when someone is applying for an exemption. What happens if we get the application in and we don't have all the information that we need?
So if an application doesn't contain all the information we need and is essentially incomplete, we won't be able to assess it and will most likely return it to you and ask that you do complete it in full and resubmit it.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. So we've covered quite a lot of ground on exemptions from the SQE, and we do want to move on to talk about the transitional arrangements. But before we do that, Natalie, is there anything else that you think it will be useful for qualified lawyers to know?
Yeah, I think there's just one other important point to note at this point. So as we've talked about exemptions, so if a qualified lawyer did get an exemption from the SQE2 assessment, they potentially might need to demonstrate their competence in English or Welsh. So this is checked after admission, but before they get issued with their first practicing certificate. And again, if you go onto our website, there's a list of ways on there where you can show your competence in English or Welsh.
Thanks, Natalie. So let's move on from exemptions. Let's talk now a little bit about the transitional arrangements. I already mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that these arrangements apply to anybody who had already started under the Qualified Lawyers Transfer Scheme when the SQE was introduced. Can you explain, Natalie, what the transitional arrangements are, please?
Yeah, so the SQE has replaced QLTS, but we do have some transitional arrangements in place for those individuals that did start the QLTS route qualification. So just to clarify the first point there, if you haven't already passed the multiple choice test, which is the MCT, the first part of QLTS, you can't qualify through the QLTS route as the final MCT has already taken place. So you will need to complete the SQE route to qualification. If you have passed the MCT, you've got two options. So you can take the OSCE, but just to point out there, the last one is happening now. And the other option is to take the SQE2. So just some dates there. If you do choose to take the OSCE and you pass the OSCE, you must apply for admission by the 31st of August 2022. If you choose the second option, which is the SQE2, you must apply for admission by the 31st of August 2023. But just a note there, those dates are something that we have been looking into, and we will issue an update on that as soon as we can.
So those are really important dates for people to be aware of, Natalie, aren't they? What happens if people don't apply for admission by those dates?
So if you don't meet the deadlines, then you can't complete your qualification under the transitional arrangements, and you will need to qualify by completing the SQE in the same way as other qualified lawyers would have to.
Okay, thanks very much, Natalie. I'm just going to turn now to some of the questions that we've had. We had quite a few questions in advance of the webinar, and quite a few of them were general questions, particularly about how you train and study for the SQE assessments. So Carol, can I ask you, for example, people have been asking, would we recommend self-study for the SQE assessments? Can you train or study part-time for the assessments, and how much does the training cost? Are you able to answer some of those questions?
Yeah, sure, Maxine. So we don't specify or recommend any particular type of SQE training or a particular SQE training provider. We leave it entirely to the individual to decide what they need, when they need it, how they can access it, how much it will cost. But we do have a list of some providers on our website. It's just a factual list, it's just a signposting. And we just sort of, we would really encourage candidates, individuals to really think about what works best for them and their budget, and also their sort of, where they're located, things like that. I think we also did a while ago run a webinar on which was intended to help candidates choose a training provider, and this is available on YouTube.
Thank you, Carol. And Natalie, we've also had a question from somebody who wants to know what happens if we decide to refuse an application for exemption. Is there a route of appeal?
Yep, so if we did refuse an application for exemption from the SQE assessments and the individual didn't agree with that decision, they do have a right for the decision to be reviewed. I would just say if you do get to that stage, you'll have a caseworker and they'll be able to inform you of the next steps that you'll need to take.
Thank you. So I'm just turning now to some of the questions that have come in during this webinar. We've had a question about when you can apply for exemption, Carol. Is there any particular sort of timeframes? Do you have to have taken one assessment before you can apply for the second assessment, or can you apply for an exemption at any point?
You can apply for an exemption at any time. So, and you don't have to apply for them in any particular order either.
Okay, so very straightforward. You can apply for them at any time, but clearly you do have to be a qualified lawyer in order to apply for an exemption.
And in fact, the decision is conditional upon that. So, just to discourage applicants who are trying to line lots and lots of things up, at the point in which you apply for the exemption and the time at which the decision is made is subject to you being qualified at that particular time and not at some time in the future.
Thank you. And we've also had a question come in from a registered foreign lawyer. And they're asking, is there any particular requirements for registered foreign lawyers applying for exemptions, or is it just the same as any qualified lawyer?
It's just exactly the same as any qualified lawyer, Maxine.
Although presumably, Carol, if someone's a registered foreign lawyer, then they're likely to be working here and they will have substantial work experience, in which case they can use that experience towards their exemption application.
Yeah, absolutely. They might be very well placed to make a strong application. And again, I think, I can't stress enough how the quality of the application is really, really important. Don't sell yourself short. Tell us everything you can possibly tell us, and provide the evidence that you possibly can to demonstrate how you meet that criteria that we apply in SQE1 and SQE2.
Thanks, Carol. We've also had a question from somebody who is asking, what's the process and the documents that need to be provided if it's a regulator or a home bar that is applying for exemption from either SQE1 or SQE2? Are we looking for different information if it comes from the home regulator as opposed to from the individual applicant?
No, it's exactly the same. It's the same content and standard wherever the application originates. So we would be looking for clear evidential an evidential basis for a qualification that maps in content and standard to whichever part of SQE the application is asking for exemption from.
Thank you, Carol. And we've had another question in from a lawyer who is from a Commonwealth country saying, are there exceptions for lawyers from Commonwealth countries in particular?
No, there are no particular exceptions or exemptions other than those that we might have already agreed. It doesn't have to be to map completely to the law or to map to the practice rights and the skills. Doesn't necessarily, we don't say it has to be from a common law jurisdiction. Again, we look at each qualification entirely on its own merits.
Thank you. And a question for you, I think, Natalie. We've had a question in from a qualified lawyer in China who's asking what documentation do they need if they want to become a qualified lawyer in England and Wales? What documentation do they need to prove that they're a lawyer from that particular country?
Yeah, so when they get to admission, they will need to provide us with that certificate of good standing, dated within the last 3 months. At this stage where my team look at exemptions from the SQE assessments, we'd just be looking for some evidence of admission in that jurisdiction.
Thank you. And I'm going to finish with you, one more question for you, Natalie. And you have covered this a little bit already, but we've had a question in from someone who says, what separates the successful exemption applications from the unsuccessful ones? Are there any patterns here? So what you've already talked about your top tips, Natalie. What would you say is the main thing for people to be aware of in terms of putting in a successful application for exemption?
Yep, so I think for SQE1 we haven't had any successful applications, and I think I would say the most common thing is that the applications are incomplete, so lots of gaps in the form, there's different columns in the form. We need to make sure that all of those are complete, and I think maybe an understanding of what we're actually asking before completing the application form. And also the lack of corroboration. So I think all in all, making sure your application is as complete as can be, it's more likely to be successful, I would say.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you found this helpful. This recording of the webinar will be available on YouTube if anyone wants to rewatch it or wants to share it with colleagues. We've got 2 further slides that have got details of further information. So here on this first slide, you can see where you'll find details of the assessment specifications. These were mentioned by Carol. They're really important documents. There's an assessment specification for SQE1 and an assessment specification for SQE2. And they set out very clearly what will be covered in the SQE assessments. And also, if you want to apply for exemption, they will also explain what we're looking for in terms of the information that we would require when applying for exemption against those assessments. And we also have some sample questions, some sample SQE questions on our website, and this slide shows you where you can find them. And then the final slide gives you details of how you can keep in touch with us. And as I said at the beginning, there's also an evaluation form. We'd be really grateful if you'd fill in that evaluation form. We want to know what you think about our webinar. Did you find this useful? And are there any other topics that you would be interested in hearing from us about? So please do fill that in if you can. You will also be sent a copy of that evaluation form as well. So thanks very much for listening. Luckily, the cat didn't appear. Some of you may be disappointed. I particularly am grateful that the cat didn't appear. Thank you very much.